Wonderful. So I could not be more excited about this conversation. I think this is really kind of all I want to talk about, and I'm so excited and grateful for our leaders who are joining us. The first one really needs no introduction in this circle, but Dr. Linda Rudolph, who's been an invaluable mentor to Climate Health Now and our growth. So she's a well-known public health physician, leader of the coalition of medical organizations who worked to put together the U.S. Call to Action on Climate, Health, and Equity. And she's also, Linda, what's the role on the DNC platform that you're working on?
It's a long explanation, but I'm working with a sub council of the Democratic National Committee called the Environment and Climate Crisis Council to make some recommendations about what the party platform should look like on climate change.
So, wow. So that's Dr. Rudolph. And then our second panelist is Mi-Jin Cha, who is joining us. She's an assistant professor at Cornell, at Occidental, a senior fellow at the Center for Data Progress. And she's an assistant professor of urban and environmental policy at Occidental College, a fellow at the Worker Institute at Cornell University, and also, this is the better way to say it, a senior fellow at Data for Progress. Her research examines labor and climate coalitions and how to support workers and communities in the transition to a low carbon future known as the just transition. Before coming to Occidental, Dr. Cha worked for a decade with public policy advocacy organizations and progressive think tanks, and is a graduate of Cornell, has a JD from the University of California, Hastings, here in the Bay Area. And we are so excited to hear your input. And last but not least is Molly Morabito, who is a senior research associate at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And she's on the political team. She's the lead for Sunrise Bay Area. And so Molly is doing research at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab on the topics of clean energy technology adoption and the implementation of improved sustainability practices in the federal government. Her research focuses on encouraging adoption of clean energy technologies across large California institutions. Prior to joining the Berkeley Lab, Molly received her master's in science in environmental policy and regulation from the London School of Economics in political science, and an interdisciplinary BA in communications, legal studies, and government from American University. She's worked on clean energy and climate policy issues in positions held at the EDF, CCF, Citizens Climate Lobby, Alliance to Save Energy, and the US Senate, and more. So very excited to have you. And that's the order that we'll go in. So each panelist will have about 10 minutes, and then we're really looking forward to about a 15-minute conversation to really brainstorm how to bring together the leadership and vision from each perspective to move forward a movement to protect our children's health. So,
and if you guys, sorry, just two logistical things. So again, please mute yourselves. I'm trying, don't be offended if I mute you also. And then we will have an opportunity at the end for questions, and we're gonna ask that people pose their questions into the chat, and Sarah Shear will be moderating that. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, so if you wanna start us off, Linda, that'd be great.
Hi, thanks Ashley and Amanda and Cynthia and Sarah for putting this together. I'm also very excited about having the chance to talk about these different but very aligned perspectives on what we should be doing in response to the economic crisis that a health crisis has brought upon us. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important for us to, and we're all here on this call because I think we all recognize that even in the midst of what is one of the worst health crises, certainly that we've ever faced in my lifetime, it doesn't make the climate health emergency go away. And I, along with many many others, believe that as bad as COVID is, the climate crisis remains the greatest challenge to our health of this century, and it is an existential threat to human survival. And it won't go away with a vaccine. It will only go away with policies that really transform our energy, transportation, building, land use, and food and agriculture systems. So you started earlier this morning asking people, what's the silver lining, if any, in COVID? And for me, the one real potential silver lining is that there's been a shift in the willingness of people across the political spectrum to actually talk about, in a different way, the role of government and the role of government investments in addressing a crisis. So if we in the health sector can successfully translate that into a public understanding that we need to act with the same urgency and the same magnitude of response to address the climate crisis, we can take advantage of the potential silver lining by making sure that the investments that stem from the COVID response are investments that promote climate health and equity. So within the health sector, there's a large group of health and medical organizations that have been working to advance a policy action agenda that the health community developed and reached consensus on last year. And I'll just briefly outline what's in it, sort of as a prelude to hearing what's in the green stimulus and the people's bailout. The policy action agenda was premised on the fact that climate change is one of the greatest threats to health that we've ever faced, and that climate solutions offer major opportunities for advancing health, since we all know that it is the living, working, and playing environments that create the bulk of ill health in the US right now. We recognize that equity must be central to climate action because climate change exacerbates existing health inequities, just like the COVID crisis is now really demonstrating to people the nature of health and social inequalities in our nation. We sort of lumped our proposed policies in two categories. One is called Climate Action for Health. And in that, we address six policy priorities. One, we know now, since this was written, there's a lot more information about the insufficiencies of the Paris Agreement to actually do what we need to do in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But we need to recommit the United States to being a leader in climate change and in addressing the climate crisis. We all know we have to transition rapidly away from the use of coal, oil, and natural gas to clean, safe, and renewable energy and energy efficiency. We think that that should happen by putting a price on carbon that actually is somewhat relative to its huge social costs, that we should have real timelines and goals for getting off of fossil fuels, and that we should favor distributed energy that builds climate resilience in communities, and develop a plan and timeline for reducing fossil fuel extraction. In the transportation realm, we of course agree that we need to electrify our transportation system, particularly starting with buses and trucks that most pollute frontline and vulnerable communities. But we think there needs to be an emphasis on active transportation with major increases in investments to support safe walking and cycling, and public transit that's accessible and convenient. And I think there's some opportunities that grow out of COVID for doing that. with some of the efforts like Oakland's opening up 74 miles of streets for walking and biking. We should build on that to figure out what investments are needed to maintain those. We need to promote healthy, resilient, sustainable food systems, forests, natural lands, increase access to parks, increase children's access to plant-based diets. We need every US resident to have access to safe and affordable drinking water and a sustainable water supply, and enhance regulations to prevent water contamination. And we need to really invest in a just transition, not just for workers, but also for the communities that are adversely impacted by climate change and by the transition to a low carbon economy. So the second cluster of policy priorities are health action for climate. And this group is part of a large number of groups that are really trying to engage the health sector in the call for climate action. We think that one of the first things that needs to happen is that we have to tell the truth about the climate health emergency. And, you know, again, the parallel to COVID, that Trump's first response was to downplay the magnitude of the crisis and to pretend like it would just essentially go away on its own. That's not going to happen with COVID, as is now painfully clear. It's not going to happen with the climate health emergency either. There's no one better than the people on this call to tell the public the truth about the climate health emergency, but we need support to do that. And particularly, we need support in local health departments to build the capacity in the public health infrastructure to address a public health emergency. We need more resilient healthcare systems. And again, we see in COVID how disinvestment in healthcare and in public health leads to a complete failure in terms of addressing a crisis. We can avoid that kind of situation with the climate health emergency if we make the investments that we need to now. And finally, we really need to focus on building resilient communities in the face of climate change. And that requires that the people that are the most impacted have the voice, the power, and the capacity to actually be full partners in building a healthy, equitable, and climate resilient future. So, you know, I've run through those policy priorities mainly as a way to sort of let people think about, and there's a lot of literature that backs up why each of these policy priorities is in fact something that promotes health, addresses climate change, and if implemented correctly, addresses health inequities. So I wanted to outline those priorities to give people a chance to sort of hear the green stimulus proposal and the 5 principles for an equitable bailout in the context of what the policy priorities are that over 150 national and regional health and medical and public health and environmental health organizations have agreed on as a policy action agenda. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really valuable frame to see everything else through. And we're so grateful for all the work you've been doing to set us up for this moment. So now we're going to transition to Mi-Jin Cha. And we'll take questions at the end for everybody again.
Great. Excuse me. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here today, and thank you to the organizers. My name is Mi-Jin Cha. I'm an assistant professor at Occidental College and one of the co-authors of the Green Stimulus. So I'll start with a little background on the Green Stimulus and then just a brief walkthrough of kind of the buckets under which our policies are articulated, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. So for background, the Green Stimulus really builds on the People's Bailout, which we'll hear about in a little bit, and is aligned with the principles of the bailout. And a group of us, some of whom were advisors to the Inslee, Sanders, and Warren campaigns, and others that are fellows at this think tank called Data for Progress, put together a menu of policy ideas to offer concrete policy proposals that could be taken up by elected officials and implemented. And the impetus, the reason why we brought this together was really because, you know, we know that there's going to be a stimulus as we deal with the economic impacts of the COVID crisis. And it's really up to us to make sure that it centers workers, communities, and the climate. And some, folks have asked, like, why should we focus on climate and why should we do it now? And in fact, I think we could think of it as the coronavirus is just the latest crisis to show us how unjust and unequal our world is. And we know that climate change will pose even bigger challenges. And moreover, there will be more health crises as a result of climate change. So in order for us to build a just, more resilient future, we need to invest in a low carbon recovery. And rather than the idea of climate being a separate issue and a separate silo, we really see these issues, COVID, climate, and inequality, as intertwined. So it's not a case of we address COVID now and climate later. We really have to address them together because they're inextricably intertwined. And more than the fact that we have to address them together, the point is that we can address them together. So it's not as if we would, address climate change or health impacts to the detriment of dealing with the COVID crisis, right? The idea is that as we start to recover from this crisis, we can really address all of these three crises at the same time, and they're all intertwined. So we have to address one to address them all. So in terms of the actual stimulus, we really focused on policies that we call shovel ready. So the idea is that as soon as work is safe to be done, we're doing the planning now so that as soon as it's safe for people to be outside, the work can begin. And the idea is then we don't want this lag between when it is safe for us to go back to work and when people can be put to work. We know that unemployment is at far beyond record levels now. So we don't really have time to then, once the COVID crisis has ended, to start planning on how to put people back to work. And the second really guiding principle is that we don't want to just create jobs, we want to create good jobs. And I think another element that is really highlighted by the COVID crisis is how many people are just underpaid and how low our wages have become. And largely our unemployment insurance programs have been grossly underfunded. So we just see this example of how deep inequality is in our country. And this is at the same time when people are working more than ever, but they're just not making the same, their wages are not keeping pace with productivity. So we don't want to just create green jobs, we want to create good jobs. We want to create work in the low carbon economy, which is a clean energy economy, infrastructure repair, home retrofits. And this is really about creating a healthier, built and natural environment for all people. So we know that these are not only good for the climate, they're good for health and they're good for the environment, with a particular focus on communities of color and low-income communities who have long borne the brunt of environmental and health burdens. So in terms of actual specifics of our green stimulus, there are 92 policy proposals in various, let's say, buckets. We call them buckets. So the first bucket is housing, buildings, civic infrastructure, and communities. And these policies really look to upgrade and retrofit the existing homes, build out of public housing. We can point to the Green New Deal for public housing as what we would kind of envision for a public housing build out. And the idea also is, again, this is work that can be done with a lot of existing workforce and also will result in good, like substantial carbon emissions reductions, but also make buildings and infrastructure healthier. The second bucket is transportation workers, systems, and infrastructure. And again, we want to electrify everything. We want to mass build out of public transportation and also focusing on fix-it-first infrastructure. So the idea here is that instead of building new roads, new bridges, all of this, we have extensive infrastructure needs. The US, I think, is ranked often failing in terms of infrastructure repair. So instead of building all of this new infrastructure, we should just fix it first. We can fix our infrastructure and make it more efficient, which also results, of course, in carbon savings. The third bucket is energy systems, labor, manufacturing, and just transition for workers and communities. And as mentioned, we really don't want the transition to a low carbon economy to be on the backs of workers and communities. We have to recognize that there will be negative economic consequences as we decarbonize. So people who work in the fossil fuel industry and communities that depend on fossil fuel infrastructure will lose all of that revenue and tax base. So again, the point is not that that is a reason for us to not decarbonize, but that we can do it in a way that protects these workers and communities. And one way is to really revive our manufacturing sector. And we can do this also through, one option is what we call the public procurement option. So leveraging the public sector procurement power and having an option so that that procurement is open to the public. So these things, basically the idea that we're trying to do is create a lot of demand for manufacturing, which helps provide manufacturers with a steady demand and steady economic outlook, create good jobs, and then also, of course, invest in a low carbon future. The next bucket is energy systems, workers, and infrastructure. So again, this is mass build out of renewable energy, and also really focusing on the grid. The grid is something that is not really talked about a lot in terms of when we talk about renewable energy, but the grid is really important, the electrical grid, in terms of making sure that any electricity that is actually produced can be distributed efficiently. It's also very old, like most of our infrastructure, so grid upgrade and upkeep is something that's really important. And here is also a real focus on quality of jobs. So what we see now is that one issue is that in the fossil fuel sector, there's a higher rate of unionization and better wages and better benefits. The renewable energy sector we see as being largely non-union, and those jobs are not paying as well as fossil fuel jobs. So we don't want to create a bunch of bad jobs as part of the low carbon future, right? That's not a just transition. So really focusing both on job quality and also on production standards. The next bucket is farmers, food systems, and rural communities. And this is, again, trying to make our food system more healthy and more equitable, and supporting local farmers. Green infrastructure, public lands, and the environment. So this is, again, greening our infrastructure. So we could think of ideas like modernizing ports and making zero carbon, zero emission ports. California has a program called the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is only for people up to 25, but we could think about expanding that out to open it up to any age. It would be a way also to create that, have the government be an employer, and also help people. One thing that we're worried about is what jobs will be created, and something like the Civilian Conservation Corps, jobs can be created wherever people are. The next bucket is regulations, innovation, and public investment. So what kind of regulations do we need to put in place, particularly to rein in capital? So for instance, if we're bailing out companies, is there a way for us to have public ownership as a result, as a condition of bailouts? So we're not just throwing public money at corporations. Public investment, so creating an infrastructure bank, for instance. So just how do we finance some of these projects? And the last bucket is green foreign policy, which is a recognition of the fact that climate change is a global issue, and that a lot of US foreign policy is exacerbating the climate crisis. So these are policies such as technology transfers, really making sure that supply chains have good labor standards and environmental standards, and kind of looking at climate change from a more global perspective. So I'll stop there to save time for questions, and thank you again for having me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for that frame. So when we were kind of planning for this, Mijin kind of identified that the green stimulus proposal is not an organizing tool. I liked how you said it was planting a left flag for what the stimulus should look like. And next up, Molly Morabito is going to share with us about what is an organizing tool, and which is totally in alignment with the green stimulus proposal and the priorities that Dr. Rudolph spoke about. So Molly, take it away.
Great, thank you.
How do we organize?
It's a big question, but thank you for having me today and for organizing this panel. It's an honor to be speaking to this community and to be on the panel with so many incredible organizers and experts. So I, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a researcher at Berkeley Lab, and I am also an organizer with Sunrise Bay Area, which is the local hub of the Sunrise Movement. And the Sunrise Movement was actually one of the organizations that helped to initiate the platform of the People's Bailout, which emerged with a digital rally on March 29th that was keynoted by Reverend William Barber and Stacey Abrams. And it's a platform that is spotlighting the extraordinary health crisis and the pandemic's economic consequences, specifically targeting the Trump administration's irresponsible response, and also targeting Congress in the hopes of avoiding the type of corporate bailout that we saw after the 2008 financial crisis. So there were about a dozen organizations that initiated this platform, all with deep roots in the social justice movement. Some of these included Greenpeace, Indivisible, It Takes Roots, Center for Popular Democracy, Working Families Party, and several more. And they all pulled together to demand that the people's government takes care of the people with no exceptions. So that's really what the 5 principles at the core of this platform are about. They're grounded in people's everyday needs, but they also point to broader structural change that we really need as a society when we're coming out of COVID. So the bailout recognizes that any short or long-term recovery to this crisis has to take into account the interrelated crises of wealth inequality, racism, environmental degradation, all of which were plaguing our country long before COVID and are now only intensifying. So to date, these 5 principles have been endorsed by 1,000 organizations, unions, and community leaders across the country, and nearly 100 members of Congress. And the idea is that different sectors and different movements will come together under these 5 principles and maybe highlight different aspects of them, but we'll all be pooling our energy as organizers and activists under the same umbrella, making the same demands, which is a really powerful thing. So I'm going to just go through the 5 principles as briefly as I can. They're also all listed in detail on the peoplesbailout.org. But number 1 is health. So health is the top priority for all people with no exceptions. And under this principle, we're really calling for health protections for all people, no matter what they're working in, no matter what communities they come from, everyone who's going to be hit first and worst by COVID. So this means supporting free and accessible testing, treatment, protective equipment, expanding hospital capacities, especially in rural areas and tribal lands, providing paid sick leave, paid medical leave for all workers without exception, expanding federal funding for Medicaid, and full funding for the Indian Health Service and urban Indian health centers. Number 2, provide economic relief directly to the people. So we're all seeing the severe economic impacts of COVID-19. 17 million Americans have filed for unemployment since the crisis began, and we've seen a 4.8% decline in the first quarter of our economy. So we know that people in our society are living paycheck to paycheck and are going to need a lot of economic support. So we're looking for broadening unemployment insurance, increasing our food aid programs, expanding housing assistance, extending childcare services for working families, forgiving or relieving student debt, halting evictions, halting rent, halting mortgage payments, and providing larger stimulus checks, particularly to lower income workers and the poor who are being disproportionately exposed to COVID risks. Number 3 is rescue communities and workers, not corporate executives. So we want to see financial assistance coming directly to workers, not to shareholders, not to corporate executives. And specifically, federal loans to companies need to be used to maintain payroll and benefits, not executive bonuses or stock buyouts. So we also want to see these funds coming with pro-worker conditions, such as company-wide enactment of a livable wage, $15 per hour or higher, compliance with high road labor standards, and worker representation on companies' boards of directors. Number 4 is make a down payment on a regenerative economy while preventing future crises. So this is the principle that's all about preparing for the climate crisis. Because we know that while COVID-19 is exposing and intensifying all of the injustices in our society that already existed, the climate crisis poses the exact same threats and will only make those existing crises worse. So while this is a moment of pain and sorrow, it's also a moment of opportunity, because during this response, we can design a bailout that provides the investment mechanisms that we need to start rebuilding our public infrastructure in a way that leads to a regenerative and low carbon economy rather than taking us back to fossil fuel dependency. So this would mean expanding wind and solar power, building clean and affordable public transit, weatherizing our buildings, building and repairing public housing, restoring our wetlands, all of the kinds of things that are highlighted in great detail in the green stimulus. And again, this represents an opportunity to put millions of Americans who need jobs back to work, rebuilding in a positive way. And any stimulus should also be focused on direct investments to working families, communities of color, and Indigenous communities, because we know that these are the people who are facing the worst of the COVID crisis and will also face the worst from climate change. And lastly, number 5 is to protect our democratic process while protecting each other. So this principle is just grounded in a really key idea that Americans should not have to worry about their public health when they're exercising their right to vote. So we need the federal government to support states by providing funding and technical support, whatever is needed, to make sure that every American can vote safely in primary and general elections this year. This could mean expanding vote by mail, online or automatic voter registration, supporting the 2020 census, keeping it fully resourced to make sure we have an accurate and safe count under these changing conditions, and making sure that the US Congress, state capitals, city halls can't just shut down until they have rules in place to ensure that governance continues and the legislative process moves on, even if in-person sessions are suspended. So these principles were all detailed in a Dear Colleague letter sent out by Senator Ed Markey and Representative Debbie Dingell. And that's a great start. But after passing the biggest bailout in American history, Congress went on recess. And this is at the peak of 2 dual crises of COVID and climate change. And when our political leaders return, possibly as soon as May 4th, the COVID crisis and economic downturn will have only worsened. So the next and 4th phase of the federal stimulus plan is shaping up to be really critical. And there's talks that it's going to focus on immediate health needs and expanding the social safety net, which is super in line with the demands we're making as part of the People's Bailout. So this is really the perfect moment to popularize the 5 principles. We have an unprecedented opportunity, as Dr. Randolph was mentioning, to shift the public narrative so that common sense solutions for both COVID and climate change are no longer these radical left-wing ideas, but they're mainstream accepted solutions. People are scared, but they're also listening. And they're seeing that the cracks in our systems are actually chasms that need to be filled in. And when we rebuild our economy, we don't need to go back to normal. We need to rebuild better and stronger than we were before. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. Do I have a couple more minutes, or is that out? Okay, well, I just wanted to discuss a little bit about how the healthcare community can support a People's Bailout. I want to emphasize that this is intended to be a distributed campaign. It's a coalition of organizations, all enacting different parts of the principles in their own local communities on the ground. So this is really something that's intended to be taken up and made your own. And as members of the healthcare community, this is really a huge moment to decide how to amplify it in your existing efforts. I also just want to take a moment to recognize the incredible voice that you have as members of this community, because right now our country is reeling and everyone is looking to healthcare workers to lead us, because we want to know how to support you and we trust what you tell us to do. So your voices really carry the most weight in this moment for both elected officials and constituents alike. I think the biggest thing is scheduling meetings with your elected officials, writing to your representatives in Congress, in the state legislature, in the governor and mayor's office, telling them that we need a People's Bailout and that any economic stimulus has to have these 5 principles and the tenets of a green stimulus ingrained, or else we're just setting ourselves up for a worse crisis in the future. Our elected leaders will listen to you, and in many ways, they might listen to you more than they've listened to the climate movement, because your voices are the most credible in a time of public health crisis. And lastly, reach out to the American people. Share your stories on social media. Talk about what you're experiencing and why you believe we need a People's Bailout and a green stimulus in response to COVID. This could be recording videos, sharing online, writing op-eds, letters to the editor, writing blog posts, any way to get your story out, because people are really listening. And the stories of our healthcare workers are resonant and powerful. And I think that those are really what can change people's hearts and minds in this moment.
Oh my gosh, this is so great. I'm really excited for your advice, because at the end, that's actually our action items, is things like scheduling meetings with our elected officials. And we are going to have a meeting on Friday, and we're trying to put together kind of the plan for a video, much like the amazing one that Sarah Shear and her colleagues at Med Students for Sustainable Future did, but with health professionals talking about the just principles and promoting them. So yes, wonderful. So I think we have a lot of really valuable questions that we want to address from the group. So Sarah, do you want to kind of share out what you've been collecting for questions?
Sure, yeah. I thought that we could start with just a question to kind of all the speakers about, after hearing each other, what are some of the resonances that you see or the ways that you hope that these proposals and voices can come together?
Oh, I can speak to that. I think one of the things that really resonated with me from what the other speakers were saying is that throughout all three of these approaches, we see equity is really the center piece. And in the Sunrise Movement, that's like what our whole movement is founded on, is the intersecting issues of inequality and climate change, and a recognition that solving one requires solving the other. And not only is that just common sense for making good, effective solutions to both of these problems, it's also a way to broaden the umbrella of the climate movement and really bring in the people who are going to be affected the most by climate change, and also just all working Americans. All Americans stand to be affected by climate and the corresponding public health crisis the same. So making that a center of all of these platforms is a way to reach people who may not have been able to be reached before.
Absolutely. Mijin, do you want to share next?
Sure. And I second everything that Molly says. And I think also, one thing that also resonated is that, I think the things that people are talking about are all structural changes, which is really exciting, right? We have way moved past the point of like tweaking our system. The system is fundamentally broken. And I think it's also to Molly's point of like, but when we say the system is broken and the things that we are looking at to address and that we implement, they're not these crazy radical ideas, right? A lot of them are very common sense measures that actually will have substantial change and will make people's lives better. And now is the moment, I think, where we can see just how, you could just think of it in terms of who has to go to work, right? Like who is considered essential? Healthcare workers, of course. And I think people don't think about people who clean hospitals, right? Like we don't think about the inequity that's so present now. And it's just a magnifying glass to how much inequity really exists in our world, in our country. But again, just to echo what Molly said, the solutions are so common sense, right? We don't have to do a revolution. We can actually change this substantially and meaningfully just by having better policies and better politics.
Beautiful. And Dr. Rudolph, what
Well,
resonated?
I'm struck by the commonality across all of these platforms and principles, that there really is a commonality and purpose of those that are seeking to address, health, equity, and the climate crisis. They are completely intertwined. And I think what Mijin just said about, these are common sense principles is sort of reflected in the fact that when three different groups sat down and thought about what are the transformational systemic changes that we need, we come up with essentially the same list of things. Two questions I have are, I'm curious that none of us yet have talked about the election. And there is still an election going on, even though some people might wish otherwise. But the Democrats and the Republicans are developing their platforms and their and what they're going to campaign on. And so a question I have for Molly and Mijin is, how do we really make sure that we inject this into the conversation that's happening around the elections? Because frankly, I feel like we can do as much as we want if we don't pay attention to getting some change in our country's leadership at the top, we are not going to be successful on the timeline that's required, because we all know that we have a very, very narrow window of opportunity for addressing the climate crisis.
Absolutely. Should we continue the conversation about the election and kind of how to collaborate on that?
I can say just a few things, and absolutely, we need different decisions, which means we need different people making the decisions. And I think now is the time to really be as vocal as possible about it, right? Like sometimes I feel like the problems are so overwhelming, people don't know what to do. And the idea that calling a congressional office will make a difference is like, seems so small considering the scale of the problem, but it makes a huge difference actually. Like just being an engaged citizen, pushing, right, the DNC, like these are all elected officials, they work for us. So we have to make them work for us. And pushing these ideas. And I think to Linda's point of how we're all echoing each other, it's really powerful. Like more people saying the same thing is how things will start to change. And we have to, that's the politics and the policy, right? What we want to do and how to move it. And which is why I think the People's Bailout is so amazing. It's like, it's such an organizing tool. And that the more that we can really organize around these issues, you know, in some sense, I feel like we could also start to say these are nonpartisan issues. We have been forced into this really hyper-partisan era, but these are things that people in rural Ohio are facing as well as in California. And the more that we can talk about the policy and how it will change people's lives for the better, I think we have to just keep pushing this message that we can build a better world for everyone. And we just not fall into these traps of this, you know, Green New Deal is toxic or whatever, these ideas, right? Like we really need to push for our ideas and make our elected officials work for us.
Exactly.
Professor Chow, what you said really resonated. Some of us were in a meeting with the chief of staff locally for Dianne Feinstein yesterday, and he was saying that the top two issues people are calling about are safe voting and making sure the Postal Service doesn't shut down. And he heard loud and clear what those top issues were. And so if we have all of us calling and expressing to our elected leaders that the People's Bailout and a green stimulus and our health is what matters most to us, that they will hear that.
Absolutely. And please save the post office. Just like
yes. Save the post office.
So we can vote by mail.
Yes.
On that note, I just put in the chat, if you're able to copy and paste, so there's a letter that public health experts have put together on the importance of election safety to not have what happened in Wisconsin happen nationally. So if you could sign that. I believe they're closing it to share out by noon today. So if you could do that, that'd be great. And then Molly, would you want to weigh in on the election organizing?
Sure. Yes, I think I agree with everything that's been said, and I'm glad that it was raised, because I feel that with all of these overwhelming crises hitting us at once, there has been a bit of a slip in the momentum that we were building around the 2020 race. And part of that is, of course, with the candidates who dropped out and the candidates that we still have. A lot of people were disappointed in the progressive movement, but that is no reason to stop organizing and stop mobilizing around it. So I think what I would really like to see is the get out the vote effort renew in the next few months as things start to stabilize a little bit. I think it's important to right now focus on mutual aid efforts in our local communities and make sure we're showing up for the people who need it. But once things feel a little more stable and maybe some shelter in place orders have changed, we can start to focus on the election again. In the meantime, calling our representatives and making it very clear that there are a lot of voices around this is absolutely right. And then shifting that focus to the public to try to engage them in the election again. I know that in Sunrise, we use something called the People's Dialer, where we're calling our members, we're calling people in our communities, we're checking in, we're asking how we can help with mutual aid. And then if we can, we talk about the coming elections in their state, because there's a lot of down ballot candidates who are Green New Deal champions and who have endorsed the 5 principles. So focusing on those races leading up to the presidential election is also a tactic that we can use. and not underestimating the power of state and local races. That has been a huge lesson since 2016, because right now the leadership we're seeing in California is some of the best leadership in the country on the COVID crisis. It can be better. It can be better on climate, but that's local and state leadership, not the president of the United States. So the presidential election absolutely matters and should be our cornerstone for this year, but local and state races are important as well to focus on.
Thank you. We have a number of questions that have come in the chat that are related to kind of the democratic platform and how to push the Biden campaign or the Democratic frontrunner to align more with these ideas. So I'm wondering if you all could speak to that.
I can start briefly. I noticed that there were also a lot of questions about carbon pricing, which I can kind of talk a little bit. So carbon pricing is not something that we talk about in the green stimulus because carbon pricing is a market solution, and we think that climate change is a structural problem that cannot be solved by a market solution. So carbon pricing is never able to be implemented at the price that it needs to actually change individual behaviors and to create the carbon reductions that we need to see for actual meaningful climate change. We're kind of beyond the point where we can just tweak our systems and decrease our individual use, right? Climate change is really a structural problem, so we need structural change. And the best way to get there is through mass retrofits to really reduce greenhouse gases, switching to renewable energy. So we don't talk about carbon pricing because we are beyond the point where we can use market-based mechanisms to create structural change.
Molly, would you want to add to that at all in terms of conversations in the People's Bailout priorities?
Sure. I believe that carbon pricing is not highlighted as a solution in the People's Bailout, although, as I mentioned, this is a distributed, decentralized campaign, so other groups may run with that. Although, in general, since many of these groups have roots in the social justice and progressive movement, the tendency would be to not endorse a market-based solution to climate change. And again, yeah, to embrace the structural shifts and regulatory intervention instead. Within the Green New Deal, which is the framework that Sunrise organizes around, there is a little bit of room for market-based approaches, and that has gotten some pushback, and deservedly so, from frontline communities who see a carbon pricing mechanism as just a way to allow polluters to pay to continue polluting, which some companies would inevitably do. I'm personally of the mind that we need a structural approach. We also need as many solutions as we can get. But the carbon pricing argument, I think, has definitely changed over the last few years because we are just too far down the line for that to catch up. So yeah, I agree with that. In terms of pushing Biden, I think that's a really interesting question. I think, yeah, it's amazing how little we've heard from him in the last few months around this crisis. And I think right now, as we're trying to call out Trump, we're also trying to call in Biden and make it clear that he's not going to win the votes he needs to win from people in the Democratic Party if he's not leading on these issues, if he hasn't endorsed a green stimulus, if he hasn't endorsed the 5 principles. So I think targeting Biden with our tweets and with our social media presence is absolutely appropriate and deserved right now. There's a lot to focus on in addition to other races, but I think calling him out directly and asking where his plan is and what he's been doing makes a lot of sense.
Beautiful. So I think,
I just want to point to something that I put in the Zoom chat. The Democratic National Committee Environment and Climate Crisis Council has a website, and on that website there's a petition urging the actual platform committee of the Democratic National Council to take bold action on climate change and make sure that it actually integrates a strong climate platform into the Democratic National platform. And that's another way to put some pressure on Biden to take climate and equity in climate seriously. So please sign the petition.
Yeah, and we can share that in our summary email too. So thank you for pointing that out. Sarah, do you want to lead us on a couple more questions, and then we're going to try to wrap up the panel at 9:52 so that we can focus on a handful of really powerful action steps for us all to take.
Sure, and we have a lot of great questions, so going to try to maybe ask a few more and keep answers kind of short, but one is about how this all fits with the Green New Deal, and whether the green stimulus and the people's bailout are a form of the Green New Deal or how they're related.
So I think that all of these things align. So the green stimulus is completely in alignment with the Green New Deal. If you hear Representative Ocasio-Cortez talk about the Green New Deal, she says, you know, there's basically three components: decarbonization, protecting frontline communities, and protecting workers and encouraging prosperity. So the green stimulus does all of these things. I think we call it the green stimulus because it is speaking to the moment, but in another world, we could call it a version of a Green New Deal or pushing for a Green New Deal. So we see them as completely aligned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the green stimulus in particular, I see that as kind of a walking out of the Green New Deal, which is just a 12-page resolution. It's not comprehensive policy at all. The idea was for it to launch a policy package that builds it out and adds the specificity. So green stimulus is an amazing piece of policy that kind of walks out what these initiatives would actually look like at the federal level. And I would love to see that framework adopted by states as well. I've actually read through it looking for pieces that we could take and push for at the California state level, because it's a plan to actually implement the kinds of vision that the Green New Deal lays out. And the people's bailout relates in terms of just reiterating the core principles that the Green New Deal is organized around, and kind of, in a way, it's a reframe, which is interesting because there has been some politicization of the Green New Deal, and there's been pushback against it simply because it was introduced by progressive Democrats. And the people's bailout is introduced by progressive organizations, but there is still a framing there that I think appeals to people who may have looked the other way when you're talking about a Green New Deal, but now will listen when you say, like, healthcare is a priority, economic relief, workers, not corporations. That it's just a different way to frame the same ideas, which can be effective.
Wonderful. And that's a nice segue into a group of questions we got about what can we be doing at the local and state level to support these ideas?
Well, one thing I'd like to comment on, if I may, that sort of relates to that. I mean, I think we've talked about meeting with electeds, talking to people in community organizations, identifying where there's policy opportunities at the local and state level that health professionals can weigh in on. But I also think it's very important at this particular moment in time for health professionals like those on this call to put some pressure on their own medical and health organizations to not back off on climate change right now, because there seems to be some concern among some of the health organizations that they shouldn't talk about anything other than COVID right now, and that in terms of policy, what they need to focus on is solely getting more resources into the health system. And while that's certainly very important, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can't lose sight of the climate health emergency and the inequality crisis just because we're dealing with COVID. And if we want the health voice to be strong in supporting the green stimulus and the people's bailout and the call to action on climate health and equity, we need our own representatives who speak for the health professionals in Washington and in Sacramento to be more aligned with what we're talking about here.
And I think that's an excellent point. And just to quickly add, I would say that kind of ask has to come from healthcare workers themselves. It's not something that a bunch of climate organizers could do, because it would just be so tone deaf to go to a medical or healthcare organization and tell them it, I mean, we can try, but I think that is really, people within those organizations are the ones who have to be delivering that message within that community, because you're the trusted messengers. And so, yeah, just reiterating that would be a really important ask to make.
Yeah. Same. I think that's such a lovely way to phrase it, Linda, that not to, really back off climate change is really, really important in this moment.
Beautiful. So I wish we had more time, but I think it's very important that we're gonna kind of shift now to some of those action steps that we're kind of getting at. So I am so grateful, Linda, Molly, Temijin, for your time and amazing input and expertise and leadership. We hope this is the beginning of ongoing collaboration, really, for protecting everything we love and making change. So thank you, thank you, thank you. If you need to jump off, that we understand, and then we're gonna shift back to kind of some local steps for Climate Health Now to take to really actualize some of these ideas.
Great, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you guys
so much. So I'm going to, again, share my screen. Let me know if this works. Share, okay, here we go. So present. So how to implement these things. This is a handful of options. So the first one is calling our federal representatives today to leave a message calling for all COVID relief being consistent with these 5 JUST principles and driven by the kind of green stimulus proposal. So we will share out a script template that you can use, and it would be really fantastic if you could call today to just be that squeaky wheel for climate, health, and equity, the opportunity to get 3 birds with 1 stone. So so we'll share out the script template. If you could make that call today, that would be really, really valuable. And then if you want to kind of take the 2.0 version and even schedule a meeting with your elected officials, we have a meeting planned for this Friday, May 1st, from just a short meeting, 12:30 to 1, and we will share the invite to that with everybody who's on this call. And that would be to kind of just walk you through how, if you haven't done this already, how to schedule a meeting with your elected officials, and then the talking points and kind of how to do that. So that will be this Friday. And then an easier option actually is just to join a virtual town hall meeting. And I learned about this through Physicians for Social Responsibility. So there's a project to help, there's a place where virtual town hall meetings, it's kind of listed when they're occurring. And so an easy thing would just be for us to individually join what's already scheduled, so we don't have to schedule it ourselves, and to, again, just bring up the same talking points about the JUST principles and the green stimulus proposal and climate and health. And we have scripts and talking points to share with you for that also. And then the easiest things, which maybe we could all do before we go have another cup of tea or something, is just signing on to 2 really important sign-on letters. So the first one, I already put in the chat, but we'll share this as a follow-up, is signing on to a letter for public health experts, health professionals, and get you in there, on COVID and the US elections and needing to make our elections safe and likely all by mail. So that would be really important if you could sign on to that as a supporter. And then the second sign-on letter is for health professionals calling for the 5 principles of a just transition, or just recovery rather. And so signing on to the letter would be really valuable. And this we'll share this presentation, and that's actually just a hyperlink to the Google form. And just to flag it in your mind, we are going to be working on creating a video to give faces to the sign-on names. So kind of stay tuned for that. And we would love for you to participate in creating a video. We're admiring Sarah Shear and her colleagues, and so we're going to try to do the same. Actually, like Sarah mentioned, when we spoke to Feinstein's state director yesterday, their staff said that they'd be willing to look at a video and perhaps promote it. So we're really going to work on that. And I think that is it for the action steps. We made it. So our next meeting is May 20th. It will, they've always been on Zoom, but that will also be on Zoom. And we will share out a summary of those action steps today, as well as these slides, if that's useful.
I'm getting a bunch of messages asking for a summary of all of these things together in one email, and I just added it to my to-do list, so that will be coming later today, as well as a link to the recording of this call.
Beautiful. Okay. I think that's about it. Sarah, Cynthia, Amanda, any other last minute things?
Just thanks again to our speakers.
Thanks everyone
Yes.
for attending.
Yep.
Amazing.
Linda, Meejin, and Molly, thank you guys so much. And again, to anyone else who is not on Climate Health Now's Slack, but interested in joining, please reach out to us.
Okay,
And
great. Have a good day.
Thank you
I just
for
want to thank
organizing
everyone
this.
for great comments. The panel, terrific, and really thoughtful comments. Thanks for the chat.
Okay, take care. Talk to you
Stay
soon.
well, guys.
Bye.
Bye.